Hello, here we are, ready to discuss the last chapter of the novel in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I have on the same shirt I had for chapter 1. Gotta represent The Great Gatsby. I told you that there was a contradiction on the timeline, and here is the most obvious one. Nick said in chapter 1 that it had been a year since these events took place, but in this chapter he says it's been 2. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really affect the plot how long it's been since this flashback occurs. So just wanted to make you aware of that. The theme of reality versus what is made up or what is a dream is explored again. It first starts with the information that emerges from the trial itself when the reporting that was done on it comes out that Nick says most of the reports were a nightmare, grotesque, circumstantial, eager, and untrue. Catherine, the sister of Myrtle Wilson, who showed up in chapter 2, testifies in the trial that there is absolutely nothing wrong with her marriage to George Wilson and that the marriage was totally stable, which is, of course, untrue. And so the story just gets wrapped up that George Wilson was a totally deranged lunatic. And while that's not totally wrong, it discounts any responsibility that may have been associated with any other character in the novel and what might have explained the despair and misunderstandings that he himself was feeling. I want you to then notice that every practical question was taken to Nick regarding Gatsby's estate. And the question for that is really, because who else is there? And what does that say about Gatsby's life and the people he chose to surround himself with, that a man that he's only known for 3 months is the one who's responsible for all of his funeral arrangements? Note that Nick has called Daisy the person he thinks would care the most about Gatsby's death, but where is she? And as Nick thinks about the logistics for the funeral, it occurs to him that it's a possibility that Gatsby does have some family. Even though Gatsby never brought them up, he never said definitively that they were dead. So his most obvious plan is to contact Mayor Wolfsheim, who only writes this lame letter in response saying that he really can't be connected to anything and he doesn't know anything about Gatsby's family. Now we get more proof of Gatsby's dealings in the criminal world with a call from a man named Slagle. He says, "Young Park's in trouble. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter." Now, one thing that I want to point out is that this is a reference to a real-life event that happened in 1922, where 2 dudes, one of whom lived in the Long Island area, which Fitzgerald did live in Long Island for real for a time, and both, once the trial happened, were both publicly connected to Arnold Rothstein, that same guy that was mentioned in chapter 4 that wasn't mentioned but was referenced through Mayor Wolfsheim about the man who fixed the World Series. And these 2 guys who were picked up were indicted on multiple counts of fraud, and that is something that would have been all over the papers in 1922 and 1923. And I think that the line that Fitzgerald uses to end the scene with Slagle hanging up on Nick embodies all of the relationships that Gatsby once had, with the exception, of course, of Nick, where the connection was broken. Then we get a new character introduced. This is Mr. Henry Gatz from Minnesota. And this character is interesting because he gives us insight into what Gatsby's earlier life would have looked like, and by someone who was there. But pay attention to the way his father talks about him. Do you think that he knows the truth about how Gatsby garnered his fortune? I would also like to point out Mr. Gatz's use of the name Jimmy. And Jimmy is the diminutive of James, which used here serves 2 purposes. Number 1, it demonstrates a sort of familiarity that a father would have with his son. But it also demonstrates a distance between those 2 characters, because I have a hard time seeing Jay Gatsby, the adult, the millionaire, as being someone who's a Jimmy. So it sounds strange and foreign, which I think reflects the strained relationship, certainly between the 2. Then comes the phone call between Nick and the former boarder, Klipspringer. Notice the choice to have these conversations occur between Nick and Gatsby's acquaintances where they're on the phone. There's already a distance. These aren't personal face-to-face conversations. And so it's like they're already really far away. They're difficult to get a hold of. It's easy to just hang up. And then, as I said a few minutes ago, the connection is broken. And to have Klipspringer call about what he does demonstrates that shallow, careless, and I think downright cold-hearted dismissal of another human being. And that's something that Fitzgerald goes back to again and again throughout the novel. Nick's determination to get Wolfsheim to the funeral after, as what I called his lame letter, motivates him to track him down in person, to get that face-to-face conversation. And there's a reference to the Swastika Holding Company, and I just want to make sure that you know, again, it doesn't have any connection to Hitler or the Germans, as this would have been beyond Fitzgerald's knowledge. And as I mentioned in class, when we talked about the Confederate flag, which was specifically created to represent that cause, the swastika is an ancient symbol that was then appropriated by Hitler at the beginning of the 1920s, and then, of course, then globally associated with him by the time we get to the 1930s and World War II. I also want you to think about the line where Wolfsheim says, "Start him, I made him." And think about what you think is actually Gatsby's authentic self. Is it when he was a teenager and the dreams that he had? Was it when he hooked up with Dan Cody for 5 years? Was it the self that he presented to Daisy Buchanan when he was involved in the war? Or was it when he was with Wolfsheim? And the question I think that's begged to be asked here is, was Gatsby ever his own man? Our understanding of Gatsby is further complicated when Gatsby's dad shows Nick the schedule that Gatsby kept about how to be awesome and how to sort of keep himself disciplined and learn new things. And it reminds me of Ben Franklin's schedule for himself as well, and being as all that he could be. It's putting thoughts into actions, and that is one thing that Fitzgerald definitely presents with Gatsby, is Gatsby was a man of action. He said he wanted to do something, and then he did it. Now, Fitzgerald uses weather again, as he did in chapter 5 with the rain. It's a gray day. The drizzle will eventually turn into rain, and that sets an important tone. Now, I want to get to a theme that Fitzgerald has pointed out before, but that I've never discussed explicitly in previous lessons. And that is the notion of clear vision and being able to see precisely what is there for its own truth. This is what's so crucial about the advertisement for Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Not only are they eyes, but they're eyes for an eye doctor whose job it is to keep people's vision correct and at 20/20. It was also sort of alluded to, which I did talk about in chapter 2, the blurry pictures of Mr. McKee. Further, Owl Eyes in chapter 3 had his glasses that magnified his eyes, which meant that he needed powerful lenses to correct his vision. And in chapter 8, when Wolfsheim, but when Wilson gets confused about the advertisement of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and whether or not they're the omniscient, omnipotent eyes of God watching and knowing every secret. And now we have, as any other scene with a character who thought that they knew something, but of course they couldn't see the whole picture, we have Owl Eyes who actually takes off his glasses and wipes the lenses so that he can see. And it's also appropriate that Fitzgerald has this character do this, and during the last chapter of the novel. I think that Owl Eyes represents that hindsight that we get when we reflect on the past. And Owl Eyes sums up Gatsby pretty darn well with the statement that he makes at his burial. I think Fitzgerald transitions beautifully with Nick getting lost in a memory, looking back on a scene from much earlier in his own life. And it is through this memory of his time going home to Wisconsin that he wonders about why things did not work out really for any of the main characters. And you're left to decide if that's an appropriate conclusion for why things got so messed up and the decisions that people made. And he talks about how the events of that summer of 1922 infiltrate his own dreams, which he thinks are represented well in the paintings of someone like El Greco. By the way, I did put a few paintings by El Greco on my chapter-by-chapter PowerPoint, which you can access on my website, either through this YouTube channel on the About page or actually on the website. And I think those paintings are so haunting and surreal and definitely worth checking out. I think it's actually surprising when you find out that they were painted in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And Nick's dream that he specifies totally encapsulates the tone, confusion, and again, carelessness of the entire novel. I'm going to read to you from that scene. West Egg especially still figures in my more fantastic dreams. I see it as a night scene by El Greco, 100 houses, at once conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen, overhanging sky and a lusterless moon. In the foreground, 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely the men turn in at a house, the wrong house, but no one knows the woman's name, and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of the brittle leaves was in the air and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. Now we get it coming, the story, the flashback coming full circle, which is what he referenced in chapter 1 about why he ended up leaving after things seemed so promising in the spring. And this is also a way to tidy up the conclusion of his relationship with Jordan Baker. They've broken up with one another, evidently, which is sometimes a surprise to first-time readers in this novel. And Jordan listens to him and then says, you know what? I've got somebody else. She's already engaged to someone else. And we have that concluding scene between Nick and Tom. Tom, who again, takes no responsibility for his actions because he was, let me be clear, 100% an accessory to murder. He knew that George had a gun. He knew that George Wilson intended to kill Gatsby. He told Wilson exactly where Gatsby lived, and then he did nothing in terms of contacting the police. I mean, Wilson walked there. This is normally something that people are driving, so it took plenty of time. And that was what Tom wanted to have happen. And yet all he does is A, do nothing and leave town. And yet still, he doesn't know that it was Daisy who was the one who was driving. And I'm going to read you one of my favorite scenes from that as well, because of course, Tom's reality is distorted as well. Nick says, I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. Now, Nick's time in New York draws to a conclusion as he says that he actually has to stay away from West Egg because he was haunted by all that happened there. And on his very last night in West Egg, he talks about an obscene word that had been written on one of the sidewalks in front of Gatsby's house, and he uses his shoe to erase it. And that's the perfect encapsulation of all that Nick has done all summer long with these people. So think about that symbolism there. And finally, the book closes with Nick going way back in time, far beyond his own experience, and imagining the thoughts and perspectives of people that he doesn't know, which I think is a very nice quality in him. To those who saw the land when it was fresh and totally uncorrupted, when the dreams of those who arrived on the shores of what is now known as New York wanted to start a new life on this land, the one that's without fault or mistakes. And isn't that a flaw of so many of us? That as we move through time, when we look back on the past, we tend to see it without the flaws and issues that it had. And so, as Nick says, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I hope that you have enjoyed this novel. It's my favorite of all time. Now, I don't think I felt that way when I was in high school, but I've had the privilege of time. I've had the opportunity to reflect and think about what these characters are going through and its own application to my life. And certainly they've shown me what not to be. I would like to think that I was never even close to going down any of the paths that these characters have gone down. But John Green makes some interesting observations about these characters as well in his Crash Course videos, which I have linked on the playlist page of this YouTube channel, and I hope that you'll please continue your education of this novel by taking a look at that. I've also included on the playlist a video to a BBC documentary about F. Scott Fitzgerald's life, which I think is important for really sort of throwing all of it together and understanding how similar some of the characteristics and choices that both Gatsby and Nick make are to Fitzgerald's own life. Also, please consider checking out the video of the book recommendations that I have posted for you. I firmly believe that reading a good book is one of the best ways you can spend your time, both now and forever. So to conclude, happy reading.